Hello, Memphis. Believe me when I say it pains me not to be with you today. And I'm not just saying that because I prefer your company to back surgery. I say this because I know the work you do is important, especially for the future of wetlands. It's important not just to sportsmen, but to all Americans. So today I'd like to discuss an issue which I think is important to your success. The issue revolves around 4 topics: political parties, the myth that a conservative cannot be an environmentalist, the concept of the public trust, and peg-leg pigs. Let's start with the pigs. You see, a few years ago, this Texan was driving through Cajun country when he spotted a pig with a peg leg walking on the porch of a farmhouse. His curiosity got the best of him, so he knocked on the door. He said, "Partner, you've got to tell me how that pig got that peg leg." The Cajun farmer said, "Mais oui, cher, let me tell you, that's a good pig. Why, just about 1 year ago, in the winter time, me, my wife, Marie, our little Clotilde, we were sleeping. And don't you know that kerosene heater, she caught on fire. Well, that pig, she smelled that smoke, and she come smashing through the door and woke us up. And just as we got outside that old house, poof, she went up in flames. Then another time, that pig, she pushed little Clotilde out of the way of this mean old rattler snake. And another time still, she dug me out from under a big cypress tree that fall on my leg. Man, let me tell you, that's a good pig." Well, the Texan was kind of nonplussed, and he said, "Well, that's a real cute story, partner, but I still don't know how that pig got that peg leg." Well, the Cajun looked surprised and said, "Why, man, don't you know? When you got a pig that good, you don't eat it all at one time, no." Well, I think it's time for sportsmen of this country to realize that most of the congressmen they've been sending to Washington have been treating them like that peg-leg pig. They consider us a valuable resource during election season. They brag about us, praise our values as good citizens and even stewards of the environment. They like coming to our banquets. They like being seen hunting and fishing with us. They especially like being seen toting a shotgun or rifle. And they know when they do those things, they can count on our help getting reelected time and time again. But when it comes to actual votes on preserving our traditions by protecting our fish and wildlife habitat, especially our wetlands, they've been carving us up piece by piece. Many consistently vote against our laws, regulations, and policies that protect what we have left, and they support initiatives to remove existing protections. I think it's time sportsmen wake up to that fact, and I think it's critical that the groups here today carry that message to sportsmen. Now, I know you're still recovering from battles with the Bush administration. I don't have to remind you they were the first in history that seemed actively anti-conservation. With a stunning arrogance, they attacked the foundations of environmental regulations that for 30 years had been the keys to protecting fish and wildlife, not to mention humans. Their mandate was new and shocking. They were out to make the environment safe for industry, not the other way around. Today, the results of that agenda can be seen across what was once pristine fish and wildlife habitats, from the Appalachian mountaintops to the big sky country out west. And I know when the Obama administration arrived 2 years ago, we thought those bad old days were over. The president and his party professed to be green. It would be morning in America again for fish, wildlife, and sportsmen. Well, that was a short-lived dream. In my opinion, the political changes brought by the midterm elections now present fish and wildlife habitat, and especially wetlands, with a perfect storm of challenges that could be worse than the Bush years. Here's what we're up against. The House has been taken over by the GOP. Now, over the last 2 years, while they were the minority party, House Republicans worked against climate legislation that would address the main cause of sea level rise. They also helped block the Clean Water Restoration Act, legislation that would restore protection to 20 million acres of wetlands, including the prairie potholes that are absolutely essential to the future of waterfowl and duck hunting. Now those very people are in charge. To say they support business profits over fish and wildlife would be an understatement. One example, Rep. Issa of California, the new chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, earlier this year sent a letter to more than 150 companies and organizations asking them to identify regulations they would like to see eliminated. I wonder, Did he send a similar letter to the National Wildlife Federation, Audubon, maybe Ducks Unlimited or Trout Unlimited? I didn't think so. And Rep. Fred Upton of Michigan, chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and Republican Rep. Ed Whitfield of Kentucky, chair of the Energy and Power Subcommittee, have co-authored a bill that would prevent the EPA from enforcing carbon pollution regulations. The Senate doesn't offer much more hope. Sure, the Democrats have a slim majority in the Senate, and they're usually more fish and wildlife friendly. But its blue dog contingent kept climate legislation from passing last year. And the GOP in the Senate has vowed to continue its opposition to most environmental regulations. Here's an example. Republican Senator John Barrasso from Wyoming, who last year blocked climate legislation, recently introduced a bill that would bar the EPA and any other part of federal government from regulating carbon pollution. James Inhofe of Oklahoma co-sponsored that bill. These men are also picking corporate profits over wetlands, fish, and wildlife, not to mention human health. By the way, one thing all these Republicans seem to have in common is they are proud members of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus. When you check their voting records, you might realize maybe the name should be the Sportsman's Carcass. The Supreme Court has become another hostile branch of government when it comes to protecting the public trust. In its 5 terms, the Roberts Supreme Court has ruled in favor of business 61% of the time. That's 19% more often than all other courts since 1953. That only encourages businesses to file away at environmental regulations. Now, the White House does hold out some hope. Since the fall elections, it has signaled a willingness to use administrative rules to accomplish some of the things Congress wouldn't act on. That might provide temporary relief, but it will also lead to lawsuits, the outcomes of which, of course, are always highly unpredictable, even more so now due to the Supreme Court's recent rulings. Besides, this administration isn't really known for standing by its convictions in the face of determined opposition. Finally, there's the struggling economy. Anti-green legislators are using it as a battering ram to repeal regulations as too costly. Failing that, GOP members have promised to cripple the effectiveness of environmental laws by slicing agency budgets. This will be a real hurdle for the continuation of vital fish and wildlife initiatives such as the Conservation Reserve Program. Now, you may have noticed one party was mentioned repeatedly in that list, the Republican Party. I'm not playing favorites here, I'm just stating the facts. Sure, there are a number of Democrats who walk the same line, but this is the avowed agenda of the Republican Party. Look, quite simply, the attitude of many of these people toward the idea of a public trust is, it doesn't exist. Indeed, if they hear the word public, they're against whatever comes next. I know some of the groups here don't like taking the direct approach. They don't like calling out specific politicians or parties. But there really is no escaping that now. If anything, there is a compelling reason now for your groups to try a different tactic. Polls show that most sportsmen consider themselves conservationists. They believe global warming is real. They claim to already see its impacts. They support climate legislation. They support wetlands protection. They support the Clean Water Restoration Act. They even favor higher fees and taxes for environmental protections. But the same polls also show they consider themselves conservatives and usually vote Republican. Yet what they don't seem to realize is that they have become that peg-legged pig for the Republicans they keep sending to Washington. In my opinion, the most important thing the groups in this room can accomplish is bringing home that reality to your constituents with some plain but strong talk. I'm not asking you to tell sportsmen they shouldn't be conservative or Republican. I'm asking you to explain to sportsmen there is nothing inconsistent with being pro-gun, pro-life, and pro-environment, because that's what they are. They should be demanding the same from the candidates seeking their votes. You have to remind them that this is part of the GOP's legacy. You have to remind them the fundamental protections and programs that made this country a shining example for the world in fish and wildlife production, that brought the U.S. its unparalleled access to public hunting and fishing, were always conceived and often supported and passed with Republican help. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Wildlife Refuge System, National Forest, the Wilderness Act, the National Park System, the Duck Stamp Program, Pittman-Robertson, Dingell-Johnson-Wallop-Roe, these were all rallying points in the past for GOP support. Yet today, the loudest and most influential voices in the GOP oppose many of these programs, many of those accomplishments. They want to gut or repeal the legal foundations that protect the habitat that make hunting and fishing possible. Now, many of these people brag about supporting our right to hunt and fish, but what sportsmen should be asking them is, what good is that if we have nowhere to hunt or fish, if we have nothing to hunt and nothing to catch? But that's exactly what they're doing. That's exactly what's been happening. Like most Americans, most sportsmen aren't really aware of this. They get their news and information from TV and talk radio. They get sound bites and punchlines. They associate all environmental issues with so-called liberals. And they've been told for decades to consider anyone who isn't a conservative or Republican to be anti-hunting, anti-fishing, and anti-sportsman. It's your job to reverse that trend. Frankly, you have to stop tiptoeing around the politicians on these issues. You have to be more aggressive. You should continue to be respectful and honest, but you can't mince words when it comes to the votes these people are putting on our resources and on sportsmen. When that happens, you have to let sportsmen know that Congressman Jones voted for higher Exxon profits at the expense of their hunting and fishing. And when you do that, you might also list how much more money that congressman got from that industry. I'd love to see the groups in this room develop a sportsman's congressional report card, similar to what the League of Conservation Voters has done for years on all environmental legislation. List the key issues on your websites, and then show how each rep voted on those bills. Send an email of the results to every sportsman on your mailing list and urge them to forward that email to every hunter, angler, and outdoors folks they know. Unless you change this dynamic, disaster will follow for our traditions, for our fish, wildlife, and wetlands. I know this from firsthand experience. My home state of Louisiana is unfortunately the perfect example. Our coastal wetlands have been reduced by 50% in 70 years. We've lost more than 2,000 square miles of swamp, marsh, primarily to projects for shipping and energy industries. This animation, based on official USGS charts and satellite maps of the last 70 years, gives you an idea of what's happened. For 30 years, many of the politicians in Louisiana that sportsmen supported have aided this disaster by voting against strict protections for wetlands. They did this at the behest of the energy industry, even when they knew the damage this would cause to our chances of long-term survival on these deltas. Because of this loss, we face the most serious threat to global warming of any spot on the continent. While most of the U.S. coast is expected to see at least 18 inches of sea level rise by the end of the century, southeastern Louisiana's coastal zone will hit 18 inches in 50 years, and we'll probably see 3 to 5 feet by the end of the century. That will put everything currently outside of hurricane protection levees underwater. We are living this catastrophe because our landmass is sinking at one of the fastest rates in the hemisphere at the same time the sea is rising due to global warming. In some of the wetlands around New Orleans, that subsidence measures an inch every 30 months. This animation, based on current elevations and the latest mid-level projections for relative sea level rise from the IPCC, is what we're up against. Now we're sinking because the levees raised for flood protection and shipping channels have starved our deltas of life-giving sediment. And the more than 10,000 miles of canals dredged for oil and gas have let the Gulf into our backyards. Yet, with the exception of the then one Democrat, our House delegation marched in lockstep with its party, the GOP, to fight tighter restrictions on carbon pollution, the main cause of that sea level rise that will wipe out the most productive estuary in the lower 48 states. We're talking about an ecosystem that is used each year by 70% of the migratory waterfowl in North America. Some 90% of Gulf marine species are dependent on these estuaries. They produce 50% of the nation's wild shrimp crop, 35% of its blue claw crabs, 40% of its oysters. Ironically, it also provides hurricane protection for 90% of the nation's domestic energy supply and 50% of its refining capacity. Yet knowing this, even in the wake of the BP disaster, Louisiana's GOP delegation joined its party in fighting tighter controls and regulations on the oil industry because the oil industry didn't like the extra cost. And by the way, they're all proud members of that Sportsman's caucus. During the fall campaign, these congressmen didn't run from that record, they bragged about it. And they got re-elected with support from Louisiana sportsmen. Well, that suicidal relationship is fairly typical among your members across the nation. So if you want to protect wetlands, if you want to have something to show for all your work, one thing you're going to have to do is help change that dynamic. Once again, I'm not making the case of telling sportsmen to become Democrats. It's a matter of informing them of the vital, critical need to find and support green conservatives who are out there. If they don't, I'm afraid we face a very bleak future for wetlands as well as other important habitat. I say that because more than anything else, the BP disaster hammered home how our lawmakers have ceded the public trust to corporations and for-profit groups. From the moment the Deepwater Horizon blew, the government's response was all about making whole groups like commercial fishers, fishing guides, marina operators, beachfront resorts, even oil rig workers. It was all about helping people who depend on these resources to make a living, who make a profit from these public properties. But what about the rest of us? What about the majority of Americans who depend on these resources not to make a living, but to make our lives better? What about our right to the physical and emotional well-being that depends on having a clean, healthy, and functioning ecosystem? We're supposed to be equal shareholders in these public resources, but it was obvious we've somehow lost that ownership right. We don't count because we can't monetize our interest, and we don't contribute millions into the campaign chests of the people who call themselves public servants. The truth is, Congress has turned the public trust into a peg-leg pig for American industry. Those industries would consume it entirely, except they know keeping it alive with public funds saves them money. But eventually, that will change too. Eventually, that pig won't have a leg left to stand on. Don't let that happen. Thanks for listening.